Thank you, Michelle, and welcome to everybody. I'm Jeff Kedman with American Purpose. I'm going to informally say hi, Anne, and hi, Dorothy, and hi, Jonathan Rauch. This session is Jewel of Jewels. We've had a wonderful conference for 2.5 days, but this is a special pleasure and privilege, and you know why, and you'll hear more in moments. Jonathan Rauch is going to do the introductions and elegantly, as he always does, manage this conversation. But let me mention to you John's new book. I hold it up. I'm not good at this on Zoom, forgive me, but it is titled The Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth 2021, Brookings Institution Press. It is selling like hotcakes. John, congratulations on that. But now, over to you and for today's conversation. Welcome.
Thank you, Jeff, so much for having me. I'm not sure how well hotcakes sell anymore, but thank you also for the book plug. But I couldn't be happier, actually, than I am to change the subject for a while. Back when I was a teenager and in college, my real aspiration was for a while to be a pianist until I realized I had no talent, and then to be a music critic until my mother warned me that that would turn concert going into a job. So I wound up doing what I'm doing, which is something very different. But like a lot of people, I've found, to my surprise, maybe, that what I think I've missed most about the pandemic period was the loss of my entire life of theater and live theater and of music, National Symphony, the Baltimore Symphony. I felt bereft and lonely, as if I'd lost a friend. I'm not the only one. Jeff Gedman was telling me the other day that a famous political writer, who I won't name, but when Jeff asked him what he's reading now, he probably expected biographies of politicians. He said, no, he reads only novels, because in today's environment, he feels such a need to quench his thirst for beauty. And of course, George W. Bush, among many others, turned to painting in his post-presidency. And I am celebrating the fact that if all goes well in October, I will go back to my first National Symphony Orchestra concert. So we're here to bring in the arts into the picture. Where do they fit into today's contentious environments? What should we expect of them? What should we not expect of them? We could not imaginably, conceivably, possibly have two better people to talk about that. Dorothy Kosinski has been the Vradenburg Director and CEO of the Phillips Collection since 2008. And if there's one destination for the arts in Washington for many years, it is the Phillips. It is the crown and the jewel of Washington's art scene. Previously, Dr. Kosinski was senior curator of painting and sculpture at the Dallas Museum of Art. In 2013, she was appointed by President Barack Obama to the National Council on the Humanities. In the course of 30 years in museum work, she's earned a reputation internationally as an accomplished curator and scholar of 19th and 20th century art. What an honor to have such a person with us. Likewise, Anne Midgette, who I've met from time to time in concert life, honored to do so. She was the classical music critic of the Washington Post from 2008 to 2019. Before that, a regular contributor on classical music and theater to the New York Times. She's a graduate of Yale, as am I. Well, no one's perfect. She's also the co-author of The King and I with Herbert Breslin, and one of my favorite books, My 9 Lives, which she wrote with Leon Fleischer, one of the greatest pianists of the last century and a man with a tragic but ultimately inspiring story. Her latest book project is a historical novel about the woman who built pianos for Beethoven. So that's probably as much as you'll hear from me from the entire rest of the time, because with a panel like this, my job is to keep things moving and get out of the way. But I wanted to start with the question for both panelists, but maybe start with you, Dorothy. We know that art can be healing for individuals. In fact, nowadays, doctors will sometimes actually prescribe visits to museums and other encounters with the arts as a way to improve their mental state. It's actually a prescription, their physical state. Can the arts, however, in some way heal our politics, our social divisions? Is that something we should expect, or is it something we should even want from the arts?
I think you're pointing to maybe the age-old dilemma of whether it's just, pure joy, sort of a rarefied and isolated experience. And I actually think there is no isolated experience, but every experience is multi-layered. So I was thinking about some of the sources for the foundational history of the Phillips Collection, which celebrates its centennial this year. And Phillips, like many of his contemporaries, was enamored with the writings of John Dewey. And way back in the 30s, Dewey was talking about, the art experience as having like an ethical dimension and an existential impact. And I think that Phillips never lost a focus on that. But for him, I think the most riveting point of departure for his entire project was the loss of his father and then of his brother, with whom he was very close, a loss to the pandemic in 1918. So there's a certain weird and eerie symmetry in our lives and the history of the Phillips. But he wrote very eloquently about finding solace, finding a way to find his way, a road to personal salvation and emotional anchoring through his work as a collector, a connoisseur, and a writer. And I think that many people today, just as you yourself, Jonathan, articulated, have rediscovered the intensity of that reaction to art. So I think the idea of healing can be very real. And over the weekend, I participated in a panel around the just closed Jacob Lawrence American Struggle series. And one of the participants was a professor of architecture at UVA and used the phrase empathetic reckoning with history. And I think in that, I found another clue in our puzzle here of thinking through how central the museum can be in a broad palette of aspects of our lives.
It's a wonderful phrase, empathetic reckoning with history. When you think about yourself as a curator, does bringing people together, psychological healing, do factors like that figure in, or are you simply looking at the quality of the pieces, the way they fit together to form the exhibit? How do you think about this?
I think a good curator considers all of the things you just said. I think that bringing context about a particular historical moment or an artist in her lifetime, or how art speaks to today, is really central. It's never an isolated phenomenon. No artist works in exquisite isolation. I think that building that context intelligently is really key. The idea of allowing the artist to allow us to see differently, that's actually a Phillips phrase. I'm sort of channel him even unwittingly, but the notion that art can open doors, again, that notion of empathy. In other words, rather than being challenged and put off by ideas, in a sense, to be led to a certain kind of openness to new realms, new considerations, new perspectives. There's a lot of interesting work going on now about the urgent issues of our time, whether it's immigration or race or climate destruction. And artists are expressing their deepest concerns and giving us ways of seeing, I guess, that idea of empathetic reckoning. And so I really think museums have a very precious and powerful role in offering a forum for that kind of encounter.
That's lovely. And it's fun to think about what Mr. Phillips would think if he were around today watching his collection traverse another pandemic and all the social travails go with that, and how proud he might be of the fact that here we are over 100 years later, and how sorry he would also be. And you dwell more in the world of music, which is often, at least classical music, a more abstract form, yet for me, somehow the most communicative of the art forms. How do you think about healing, about larger social, bringing us together versus being controversial, polarizing? Is there even a role for that? Is that the right way to think about music? Oops, you're muted.
I will add parenthetically that I actually began my career as an art critic, and I think my background in visual arts, in terms of my academic training, is much deeper than my training in music, which was always a passion and something I followed on my own. But I've definitely had experiences in both worlds. My reservation about the idea of art as healing, and I say this as someone who definitely worships at the secular temple of the arts as a source of nourishment and mental food and all of those things. But the idea that the arts heal us comes perilously near to a view that some people extrapolate from it, that the arts are something lovely and beautiful that add color to our lives and are pretty. And it offers a view of art as a balm in the best sense, and worryingly art as spinach in the worst sense, something that is good for you, which is something you encounter a lot in music, especially with newer works that audiences don't like but know they ought to embrace. I think that, as Dorothy was really saying, art is so much more than that. And if art is healing, it's partly because it's putting you in touch with something larger than yourself, taking you out of your own concerns and making you think more globally. And that can often be difficult and challenging and painful. Art is not always this lovely thing that takes you out of yourself. I mean, and we have developed a canon, particularly in classical music, that is much easier to process. It's all lovely works of the past. And we forget that a lot of these works in their time were ugly and alarming and shocking, be it the late quartets of Beethoven, which sounded awful to ears at that time, or an opera like Carmen, which today we think lovely Spanish local color. And in its day, it was like, why would you put that filth on stage? It was as if somebody had gone to the ghetto and filmed, horrible lowlives. It was not embraced at all. And our aestheticizing of art has worked to its detriment, in that people who have that approach to art then are often ill-equipped to deal with art of our time that is less pretty in their view. I mean, the works of Robert Mapplethorpe are an interesting example of work that was incredibly polarizing, that people couldn't, that a lot of politicians had a great deal of trouble dealing with because it didn't fit into the idea of babbling brooks or whatever. I would also add that as an artist, or as somebody who deals with art, trying to predict the audience reaction to anything you do, a museum show or a music review, anything, is a fool's errand. And one of the great things about art is that our relationship with it is so intensely personal that you can't really know what my relationship with it is, and vice versa, and that we may have very different feelings about it and both be right. And in classical music, that's terribly forgotten, but I think it's generally forgotten. I mean, if you say that you don't care for Beethoven or Brahms or Bach, you must be an idiot, right? But if you say you don't care for broccoli, nobody is going to raise their eyebrows. And the idea that we should have a multiplicity of views and tastes gets obscured a lot in the rhetoric of art is good for us, art is healing for us. So in this kind of discussion, I would love it always to be forefronted that art is something that offers us a different lens through which to see our lives. and it offers us ways to tackle some of the important questions of our lives. And to reduce it merely to that which makes us feel good is to imperfectly understand what it is we're talking about.
Well, it's lovely, and it's certainly true that even what are now the canonical, uncontroversial pieces were Beethoven's Eroica, radical in its day, and of course initially political. Stravinsky's Rite of Spring obviously horrified audiences initially. Carmen was a flop the first time it went down. But let me just for a minute push back a little bit in a particular respect and say one of the things that I realized by not having concerts, classical music concerts, is that this is a unique experience in my life because it can't happen unless a whole lot of people come together for a single period of an hour, 2 hours. The phones are off. We're not doing our email. An orchestra, a composer, and an audience are united in a kind of collective act of concentrating on something, and that something is not themselves. And it's not politics, and it's not the swirling world outside the concert hall. And in that sense, I felt a sense of community and togetherness in that hall, which I miss.
I certainly understand that. And I myself am somebody who loves the concert hall and the red velvet of the concert hall and the idea of listening raptly in silence to concerts, all of which are relatively recent in the bigger timeline of classical music. I mean, a classical concert in Beethoven's day wouldn't have been very silent at all. And an opera in Rossini's day would have been more like a ball game with people, hawking their wares and, shutting up for the big arias, maybe. And I think that idealized vision of everybody coming together in a kind of communion, it does happen. But goodness knows, we've all been in audiences where somebody's reading the program notes and somebody else is falling asleep and somebody's itching. I mean, it's a world there. You're together with a world experiencing something for a fixed time. I mean, the same is true in a movie theater. The same is true in a stage theater, a ballet, anything in the performing arts. You are brought together in that kind of communion. But one of the exhilarating things about the pandemic was the acceleration of a trend I've already seen, certainly in classical music, where some of the most exciting, vibrant, vivid stuff is happening outside those big halls and those big institutions. And there was a wealth of exciting material from organizations large and small and individuals during the pandemic that maybe couldn't have happened without the pandemic. And watching artists, watching performers in particular, be creative in new ways and being forced to be creative in new ways was a real reaffirmation of the spirit of art that can sometimes get deadened in the prescribed climate of an orchestral concert or an opera house, the two places I spent most of my time as a music critic. This is, of course, very different for visual artists and writers who were able to create in all kinds of other ways whose flow was maybe not as interrupted, although the exhibition spaces certainly were interrupted. But I think in music, it was actually a very exciting kind of fertile time. And I'm eager to see whether that enforced silence and that enforced removal from our communal experience of art gives everything a new impetus. If we all go back to the concert hall with a new appreciation for it, for exactly what you were talking about. If you came to realize that you missed it, perhaps you come back with a new interest in it. And that's going to be the $64,000 question, incidentally, a slightly different thread, but for orchestras to see whether people are coming back or not. My fear was rather the opposite, that many people would realize that they hadn't really missed it or that they were getting fed in that way from recordings and streaming experiences and maybe didn't need to go as often. And only time will tell. I know the Metropolitan Opera has sold very, very poorly this fall, except for opening nights, but the Metropolitan Opera didn't act very well toward its artists and unions during the pandemic, and there could be a certain amount of resistance. And of course, we're not all the way out of the pandemic yet. Some people may be waiting to see whether there's really going to be performance before shelling out $200 for a ticket.
Yes, well, I'm supporting, I'm donating, I'm going back. When I can't go back, I'm giving anyway, and I hope others will do the same. Let me just, with Dorothy's kind permission, just stay with you just for a moment longer, Anne, before we bounce back over to Dorothy. In our prep call, when we talked about this, you made a really interesting distinction between art and the arts And I noticed you've used the phrase "the arts" in talking over the last 10 minutes. Could you just familiarize us with that distinction and why you think it matters?
I think it's a vital distinction, particularly in my former field of classical music or my ongoing field of classical music. I think in classical music, certainly we've been sold a bill of goods that art is indistinguishable from the institutions that present it. That is, whenever somebody talks about an orchestra closing or cuts of an orchestra, people rise up and say this is an attack on Bach and Beethoven and Brahms, and this is awful, as if Brahms were synonymous with the orchestra that played him. And I see the arts as a sort of artificial description of a group of institutions. And a lot of the elitism we decry and denounce in this field is centered around the arts, which is distinct from art. Art is creative, art is people making things. Art is the work of Beethoven, which is not going to be affected even if an orchestra or two closes. And in classical music in particular, this blind idea that tradition must be upheld at all costs, I equate it to trying to keep factories open because factories are important. If a car factory closes, it closes. And if it opens, it opens, but nobody thinks cars are going to end. If a restaurant closes, people may be very, very upset, but nobody thinks that food is at risk. But if an orchestra closes, people, as I said, are so upset about the idea of decline of the West and the arts, or nobody appreciates music anymore. And the result of this is that we've kept a lot of institutions open beyond their use-by date. And I say it's as if we had a lot of factories manufacturing antique cars, say a 1950 Cadillac, and saying, this is the best car, and we've got to keep manufacturing it. And everybody's like, yeah, we really like that car, but we want a Tesla. And the climate is so filled with Cadillac factories that there aren't enough room in this field for Tesla factories to grow up, and that there's a lot of demand for new things that these institutions aren't necessarily upholding. And I do say this as someone who loves a classical symphony orchestra and the velvet seats, but there are just so many other ways to approach music. There are so many other ways to hear Beethoven. And our age is one of the first in music that's really codified all of this to a point that it's just not appealing to a younger generation. And it has nothing to do with the music. Plenty of young people love Beethoven, but don't at all have any interest in buying the ticket to the red velvet seats and sitting there in silence for 2 hours. And there are so many ways that they could find Beethoven that aren't that. And the field as a whole has not been very interested in finding that. So that's why I think it's an important distinction, because the art is alive and well. The arts are struggling. And we've been led into a whole discussion about why the arts are dying that completely ignores the vibrancy of the field and gets lost in what, to my opinion, is the wrong discussion.
So just to clarify briefly, are you simply describing the situation, or are you arguing that actually the arts, capital T, capital A, are operating to some extent in a way that is snuffing out or damaging art, which is a more provocative causal claim?
I believe that's both. I think I'm describing the way it is. I think the arts is not a useful term. I think that the arts has come in people's mind to represent this kind of elitism and these institutions. And that when the arts are invoked is usually in a context discussing these institutions, and that getting rid of the whole term the arts and focusing on art would be a much more helpful way to approach the whole issue for basically for everybody.
Dorothy, thank you so much for your patience. You're in a different position because you, of course, are heading one of the country's leading arts institutions. I'm going to put Anne's point in a more provocative way than she did on purpose, just to stimulate a response. In your role, do you find that the institutional demands, that there's a bureaucratic life that actually in some sense diminishes or smothers spontaneity and creativity? Is there such a thing as sort of big arts that have become too institutionalized that you have to worry about? Does it hamper you? Tell us, dilate a bit on the distinction Anne is making.
Let me just throw in that I think the Phillips is an institution that really does present art and that doesn't get so caught up in this. And I'm not saying this just because I'm on a panel with Dorothy. I really, truly believe that the Phillips has a lot more vibrancy than a lot of these big institutions do and is really working on this issue.
Oh, and you're lovely to say that, but and everyone will have to indulge me if I do start out with what Jonathan invited me to contemplate about, that is the Phillips. So I'm very lucky to be shepherding this institution because its very premise is kind of anti big arts. The public loves it because it's this rather unusual art-going experience of a domestic scale setting, smaller galleries. You don't walk in and immediately look at your watch and say, oh my God, how will I get through gallery G? Because there is no logical route. I mean, it's you get lost and you should feel happy with that. And as Phillips himself said, he railed against the isms. So he was really not at all motivated as originally a private collector to follow the roadmap of, romanticism, realism, impressionism, post-impressionism. He couldn't have cared about that, and therefore blissfully, followed his own compass. So with that as part of our Genesis story, we feel a certain freedom as well. Also, we are not so wealthy as larger institutions. We don't have the same kind of federal support as many of the arts institutions in the District of Columbia. And that also presents a certain mixed blessing. We have to scurry, but and be nimble, but we have a certain creative freedom. Many of my colleagues said to me, oh God, how'd you pull this off so quickly? Or I could have never gotten this through the gates in X organization. So I'm blessed with that freedom. But to just go back to Phillips's philosophy, so he wasn't interested in the isms. He didn't have to be. He was interested in fluidity. So unlike some of the organizations, museums that were founded just about the same time, he said, lend it, move it, add to it, change it, create new conversations. That's a very wonderful, fluid and creative intellectual environment in which to create your project, and for us to bring it into its next 100 years. But the art and arts, so when I said so we have to be nimble, it's a mixed blessing, that brings me around to an issue that I brought up in one of our prep conversations about how in this country, the arts, sorry, Anne, the cultural institutions are not posited in any tangible way at the heart of our society. There is no Ministry of Culture. We have this strange backdoor charitable deduction funding mechanism that people don't understand, don't talk about, the public doesn't understand. It leads to a certain accusations of elitism, or it leads to precarious funding passages in an institution's history, perhaps to irrational or imperfect decision-making. And I think, so I quoted in that same meeting, I think, my wonderful colleague, Smithsonian Secretary Lonnie Bunch, who used a phrase like, the museum is not a community center, but it had better be at the center of the community. And so I use that simply as a segue for us to think about what our governmental, societal funding models, how they reflect values and what the impact that has on our health of all of those cultural institutions. And then what can we do, we who are involved in creative practice and presentation, what can we do to augment being at the center of our community? And many museums are involved in that, whether it's working with teachers, kids, veterans, Alzheimer's patients, helping doctors in training to hone their diagnostic skills through looking at art. I mean, the list is so long, and actually I could send on some links for that could be added later on, but all of those things, or giving artists the platform to express their sense of outrage or urgency or despair. Those, that idea of how do we put a cultural institution at the very center of our community?
Would it be fair? I'm sorry, Anne, yes, please.
I was just going to say that I don't see putting something at the center of a community links to government money necessarily. I think that if you look at the Museum of African American History and Culture, which recently opened, when it opened, that museum was at the center. There were lines to get in. Everybody was talking about it. That museum created a focus and is at the center of a community by virtue of what it is, what it stands for, what it represents. And yes, that happens to be a large government institution, but I think that funding doesn't tell the story of how you center yourself in a community. I would throw in, though, that everything about contributing to different ways of reaching the public is much truer of museums than many other of the arts. And people often say, oh, we don't want classical music to become a museum. And by that, they mean something dusty, a repository of the past. And I always say, we should be so lucky. Look at museums in America and everything they've done to reach people and all the different kinds of shows we're seeing and all the different ways museums have become far more vibrant and vivid than most classical music institutions. But I don't think you can become a part of the community purely by prescriptive measures or by the government throwing you a lot of money. And one of the things I resent about the term the arts, particularly in America, is it draws a line around certain kinds of art. There's a lot of thriving art and culture in America that we don't consider part of the arts, or that is, God forbid, commercial. And even Broadway, right? And much less popular music of most kinds doesn't get put in that bubble unless we decide to embrace it and bring it in as a pops concert. And film, there's a lot going on and people are very connected. And then literature, there's a whole range of different kinds of books. Those are all arts. The arts are thriving in America. If you want to, art is thriving in America. That's why I say the term the arts. When I say the arts, when you say the arts, we here listening probably all automatically understand that as museums, operas, the things we think that more Americans ought to care about. And if we were able to open up that definition and open our own eyes, I think that we would succeed in cutting off the arts a lot less. The funding issue is another question, because it is a question whether orchestras can survive well without significant sources of funding. But then you have to open up the discussion of what the government does and doesn't fund and why non-commercial forms of art need to be supported. And obviously they do to work economically, but I know I will hold off on that because that's galloping down a different track than you had us on right there.
I think I was at fault for mixing in two things, but I was pointing to funding more as a reflection of values on one hand, but the idea of being central, a center for the community, I think implies, being open to all possible art forms and art as a community engagement. And in some of the ways that I mentioned in terms of, teaching, healing, offering a variety of avenues of access.
I believe the Phillips does that admirably. I believe the Museum of African American History and Culture does it admirably. I see, and I'm speaking about Washington institutions because that's been my frame of reference for a while. And there's also, those are sort of national and nationally funded bodies. The Kennedy Center has been trying to figure out what that means for it and has a lot more difficulty kind of incorporating different kinds of art, although it's really been trying, definitely. How do you incorporate commercial or non-classical art into the arts in 2021? I don't think it should be quite as hard as it is in terms of the performing arts, but I think that those bridges are still very difficult to cross, and that it's hard to be part of the community as a whole in a city where you're kind of cutting out a large part of the vernacular culture of that city. And again, I don't feel this is a charge I'm throwing. I mean, a lot of museums in Washington are very much central to the community and to the American community. People who come to Washington go to museums. It's a big thing for visitors to Washington to do. I don't think that people come to, the performing arts in quite the same way.
It's a good point. It stings a little bit because to some extent, American orchestras and American journalism are in the same boat, which is their business model is in trouble. They're striving for a new one. They're increasingly reliant on big money philanthropists to bail them out. You work for the Washington Post, so you know about that. I have only kind words to say about the Post, and I'm glad it's still alive. But there are compromises there. And on the other hand, a big change, I think, it's purely anecdotal, but in my childhood, museums were places where school children were forced to go. Now they're crowded. Museums all over the country of all different types are destinations, and they're busy and they're dynamic. And it's a very interesting difference. Dorothy, why is that a correct observation? And if so, what do you think accounts for that dynamism in your world?
I think the dynamism of the artists, actually. I really think that the excitement emerges from the contemporary practitioner right now. There's just such a sense of excitement and wonder and engagement around contemporary artists that people want to go, they want to see, they want to listen. And I think it engenders, and again, I go back to its curatorial responsibility to build context, but while you're there, you're also seeing connections to an artist of an earlier generation or earlier historical period and connecting the dots. But I just think that there's such vitality right now, a multiplicity of voices, that really is driving that hunger.
Yeah, it's so much pluralism of vision. If you go to a institution like Glenstone in the DC area, it's completely itself. It's established a whole atmosphere, a character, a whole aesthetic of its own. You won't get it anywhere else. It's just very experiential. Dorothy, how do you manage politics? I mean, you're in Washington, DC. I think you mentioned in our prep call that you kind of get it, or not you personally, but people in your world kind of get it from both directions. They're either not political enough or they're accused of being too political. Is that a problem in either your life or the life of curators who may be a little bit less well situated than the Phillipses?
I think we all live and function in a highly politicized environment. I think that every one of my directorial colleagues in the museum field feels similar pressures. I mean, it's been quite a pressure cooker for the last 18 months with intertwined urgencies and pandemics. Few of us, I would dare say, we're trained to deal with pandemic health issues and closures and sort of how to make your staff whole, just all of that. But the related urgencies around social unrest, social inequities, those are issues that we care deeply about, and our artists care deeply about. My staff does. My trustees have had leading voices in supporting, advocating for exhibits that have dealt with issues of immigration. That's what we want to do. I think that's part of being central to your community, is offering ways of understanding, of seeing yourself and your issues reflected on the wall. But, in one of our centennial exhibits, we, on a most superficial level, we were telling the world, Phillips still collects. You know, it's not a moribund, static institution, but in many ways, we were also saying, and we are deliberately and joyfully embracing diverse voices, new artists, artists of color, women, much, you know, with a lot of energy, perhaps much more than since Phillips himself shared those enthusiasms. We also brought in voices from the community in labels and commentaries, and some, I have to say, we had so much fabulous and very empathetic and understanding, intelligent response from the press. But there's inevitably some people who say, why do I care about the voices of a 12-year-old or of a pastor at a local church or a teacher at a high school? You know, who cares about that? They seem, some critics can feel threatened by the intrusion of voices that peculiarly they feel threaten the notion of expertise. And maybe I'm confident in expertise because I truly embrace these different voices because it makes it more interesting. It creates that conversation that Duncan Phillips was charged up with. We did a show, it just closed this weekend, which we called Inside, Outside, Upside Down, and it was explicitly reaching out to the community. It was an invitational juried show, very noted artist from DC, Renee Stout was the guest curator. So there were 65 works of art by artists from all around the region. We actually purchased some works, that was really exhilarating, just to demonstrate the profound creativity, the multiplicity of voices, the sophistication, the energy of artistic expression in our community. And finally, after far too long, we picked up a baton that Duncan Phillips had in his hands decades ago of encouraging artists in the community, of purchasing and bringing into the collection and giving those creative voices a platform. So I think that that meshes and melds and bolsters the historical collection at the Phillips and gives it new dimensions that are very exhilarating.
That's wonderful. Thank you. We got about 15 minutes left, and I'd welcome people who want to participate with questions or brief comments. We have one from John Williams, who I see on the screen now and who's a regular visitor. In your rich experience of music or art, do you think you have encountered or some music or art that is harmful to empathy? Either of you like to reflect on that for a minute? Then we can go to Paul Kroeger after that.
I think reactions to art are so individual, it's very difficult to say that something is harmful to empathy, but there's certainly art that has an agenda, art that is trying to promote, you know, a political agenda. You could look at the various forms of socialist realist art in, you know, Russia or the Nazi German version of that. I don't think art has ever been very successful when it's set out to be pure propaganda. And of course, entire reams have been written on that. But you could argue that that is, you know, harmful to empathy, that there are, you know, anti-Semitic pieces from Nazi Germany that were, you know, harmful to empathy, although you could say that that raised empathy in people of sensitivity encountering them. That would be my only take. I don't think you can quite say that art has the same political force as a propaganda pamphlet or something.
Dorothy, any additional thoughts on that?
I would agree with Anne's comments. I think a propagandistic piece shuts down thought and reflection and interaction. Works of art foster an openness and a vulnerability. So I think that maybe maybe that's a kind of, in my mind, a criteria in terms of differentiating between some heavy-handed, agenda-driven work versus an art of subtle expression.
Well, thank you. Paul Kroeger, you had, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. I think you had your hand up earlier. Would you still like to chime in? I'm given to understand by Michelle that you are in fact an opera singer.
Yes, sir, that's correct. And I actually just read your book. It's fantastic. I've been recommending it. But yes, that's correct. I was singing opera in the last 6 years in Germany. And the conversation you guys were having about the centrality of art to our societies kind of made me think about the funding schemes in Germany versus in the United States, because there, all of the theaters that I worked in were state supported and funded by tax dollars. The tickets were cheaper than they are here. And at least in my personal experience, I had health insurance, I had a salaried job as a soloist, and I do see a big difference in how opera is even put forth, like how the productions look, because they are not worried about rich people paying for the opera. They have state funding. And so I was wondering if you guys, we kind of touched on it a little bit. I was wondering if anybody had some perspective on whether government funding might, in art in general, change how we make art.
Well, I lived in Munich for 11 years and began as a journalist there and began my career as a journalist writing about exactly this issue of Germany was just reunifying. And my first big piece as a journalist was about opera in newly reunified Germany. I mean, reunified like it was reunified the month before I started writing the article. And at that time, we thought a lot of opera houses were going to close. And of course they didn't, which is really interesting. But yes, absolutely. I think people in America have trouble understanding that when you work in Germany in the opera and you can get a full-time job and then you are a government official. And in America, there are no full-time jobs in the opera. The Metropolitan Opera is the closest we have, and it's only open 7 months a year. And in Germany, really every opera house, except for a couple of weird private ones, are open 10 months a year, and then you get a paid vacation for 6 weeks and you get health insurance. And the difference is phenomenal. The town of Pforzheim has this little bitty opera house, and it's a full-time opera house, and people in Pforzheim can see opera and ballet and orchestra. They have it all right there. And they employ people, even their chorus is a full-time position. Yes, it makes a huge difference. That said, opera has a different position historically in Germany than it does in America. And I'm not sure you can force opera down people's throats quite the same way in a climate that doesn't allow Broadway. I've had plenty of arguments from Americans that, Broadway is inferior to opera. And I say, oh, come on, are you saying Sweeney Todd is inferior to Land of Smiles by Franz Lehár? I mean, I love both works, but one is Broadway, but kind of a great, profound work, and one is a light and lovely thing. And I would say that Old Man River is a part of the American psyche in the way that Wagner is a part of the German psyche. And by psyche, I mean that a man on the street could probably hum a little bit of Wagner in Germany and probably can't here. There are those roots. It's been a part of the culture for longer.
And you're actually, there's a question specifically about this. So now is as good a time as any. Susan Brewer wonders, does music face a more difficult task due to, I guess she means, does art music face a more difficult task due to the enormous competition by commercial music?
Well, when Dorothy was talking before, and you were asking Dorothy about the vitality of museums, this is a point that is essential to that question, that visual arts museums are the only one of the arts in which the commercial is still a part of the museum. That is, collectors are still buying work, and people who are actively making work are part of a museum's culture. In music, the canon is pretty much all dead people. And even our most successful living composers don't enjoy anything like the status in the classical music world that some of our living artists enjoy. And that's just a huge difference in outlook. So I don't think it's inherent to the art forms specifically, but I think it is inherent to the way the arts are set up, that our musical canon makes it more difficult for the living to prevail, and therefore for that kind of vitality to happen.
If I could interject, because I think Mr. Kroeger's comment is very interesting. Just like Anne, I was 12 years in Basel, Switzerland. And when I think back to that relatively small town, the vitality of the museums and galleries, the performing arts, music is astonishing. And yes, there is cantonal and federal funding of the arts. But one thing that I think is very important for us to think about is the difference in how art, visual art, music, is part of a normal education. And in Europe, it really is knit into the educational experience from when one is a small kid and right on through, so that going to museums is just de rigueur, or that idea that there is a very grassroots engagement. Music making even exists in more of a real sense. And so we have to clear-eyed look at how we've dismantled our public educational system pretty rigorously since, I don't know, the 1970s. And to a big extent, the entire museum world has jumped into the breach so that I raise private money in order to amplify arts integration, helping to teach teachers to use the arts to teach their core subjects better. We do outreach in classrooms. And so Phillips is a small piece of a huge puzzle of, again, it almost feels like backdoor. We raise private money in order to fill the gap of what we as a society has decided is unimportant. And I think when I talk about, we're touching like butterflies on so many complex interrelated topics, federal funding, this and that. But I think the role, the big gaps that we've consciously built into our educational system is somewhere at the heart of what we're talking about. Sorry, I got on my soapbox. Should I put it aside?
Not at all. Well, I have to give an apology to Shirley Marty Hargis because we're going to you next. And I just got the message that the next event is starting. And unfortunately, tragically, I have to end on time. Jeff Gedman, you are a very unkind human being. But you are very, very generous to allow us to take an hour on this subject, but especially Dorothy and Anne, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you for the work that you're doing and reminding all of us that there is more to life than politics and the day-to-day, sometimes grubby existence that we in the political world are living. Take care, everybody.
Thank
And
you.
thank you, Jonathan. That was
Thank you.
fantastic.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Really great.